I'm Conor Friedersdorf, a staff writer at The Atlantic magazine.
And I'm Michael Dougherty, politics editor at Business Insider and freelancer wherever will pay me.
And frequent and beloved Blogging Heads guest as well.
Yes, thanks.
So let's talk Anders Breivik, the guy who went on a shooting rampage. Was that last year, earlier this year? I'm forgetting now.
It was last year. He set off a bomb that killed 8 people. And then while authorities were scrambling to figure that out, he gunned down 69 people, including teenagers, at a kind of political camp, geared towards young people.
Right. And toward, was it the elite of all of Scandinavia, or was it just Norway, or was it...
Well, certainly he wrote and copy and pasted and put together a 1,500 or 1,600 page manifesto,
right.
Which indicted all of Western leftism and liberalism for the baleful state of the West. And but he definitely has it in for Norway's political class in particular, obviously by his actions, and then also today in court he was brought in and he very specifically singled out that he didn't recognize the court because it was created by it was created by political parties that believe in multiculturalism, and that the judge is friendly with the head of the Labour Party and the Prime Minister. And so, yeah, that's where he stands. And it's very obvious to me that he's trying to make this into a political trial.
Right. Yeah, I think there was a line in his manifesto that said, once you're arrested, the propaganda operation starts, or something to that effect.
Yeah, and he really made a show of it today. I mean, it was really dramatic footage, I think. He, lifted his hands up to have the cuffs taken off, and the minute they were taken off, he turned to the cameras and he put his fist on his heart and then put it out in a kind of pastiche of a Roman salute. And he sat there, and the Daily Mail and other tabloids made great fodder of how stone-faced he was during an hours-long reading of the details of the victims and how they were massacred by him.
Uh-huh.
But then he began to choke up and tear up when he saw pictures of himself in his paramilitary gear and uniform. And even, there was some work today done by, I guess, the representation of the state, trying to show Breivik as kind of a depraved small person who lived this entire fantasy life.
Mm-hmm.
And they talked about his World of Warcraft playing, and he was, smirking through all of that. So it was interesting, to say the least. I've taken an interest in the Breivik case for a lot of reasons. One is that it pains me to say that I agree with Breivik on certain things. I mean, he quotes writers that have written for the magazine I used to work for, the American Conservative. But there's this cartoonishly evil, and it's not even cartoonish, there's this horribly evil method that he went about trying to implement his vision for Europe. And I also find it interesting because I do really wonder if Norway's political class has the wherewithal to withstand his rhetorical attack on it.
Well, so from what little I've read, about his beliefs, one of the things at issue in the trial is whether he is in fact insane or not. And
yeah,
he was originally declared insane by someone who examined him, and then there was an outcry about that, and there was a second examination in which he was found to be sane and able to stand trial, is my understanding. And now part of what's at issue is whether his antagonism to multiculturalism is insane, right? Now, I assume that even in Norway, merely being opposed to multiculturalism isn't deemed insane. But of course, this is about as extreme and violent a manifestation of that belief as you can imagine. But I saw that he was intending to call or he put together a list of witnesses to demonstrate that lots of sane people shared his views. I saw on the list the blogger Fjordman, who writes, or at least wrote long ago, and I was reading it. What's that site? Brussels Journal?
Yeah.
Which is a sort of right-wing site that writes about multiculturalism in Europe, and I don't know. I think I must have gotten to it from Instapundit links or maybe Andrew Sullivan links after 9/11, and it sort of faded away from the circle of blogs that I read long ago. I don't know if it's still out there. Maybe it is.
It is, yeah.
Okay. And so why don't you tell me about, I guess, what is it about the beliefs that he expressed that you agree with and that you don't think that the Norwegian elite will be able to grapple with?
Okay, I have to separate those, right?
Yeah.
The part I agree with, just generally, is I would like to see a more a Europe that is Christian rather than modern and liberal in a lot of ways. I would still like Europe to have liberality as a virtue and tolerance as a virtue. That's the basics of it. And I do think mass immigration can be a problem for European nations, and for any nation, actually. And that's about as barely as I can state it, right? That's about where my agreement with this guy begins and ends. The reason I think Breivik's rhetorical assault on modern Europe and on Norway's political class is potent and dangerous is precisely because I think Europe does not know how to articulate a defense of the norms it seeks to continue in its society. And some of this, I think, was touched on in a book, Reflections on the Revolution in Europe, by Weekly Standard author Christopher Caldwell. Mm-hmm. And he talked about how Europe's secularism was designed to kind of box in Christianity, and how it's very awkward when it tries to box in Islam or other religions that are not Christian.
Right.
And I think, in a sense, I think Breivik can turn Europe's modern liberal understanding values against itself, right? Which is that, you say that we must understand the grievances of Islam and Muslim immigrants. Well, understand my grievances with you now. And so I just don't know. I don't know if Europe has the wherewithal to kind of
let me,
in a way, like Anders Breivik. What I'm trying to say is, like, Anders Breivik himself is kind of like going to appeal to multiculturalism itself in a strange way, which is to say that he will say, "You are not competent to judge me," because I am appealing to a different standard, a different culture than the one that you uphold.
Okay. So I guess a few thoughts. It doesn't seem likely to me that multiculturalists will have a problem rejecting Breivik. I don't know that they will be able to lay out a cogent analysis of why they can so easily reject him and why they have more difficulty rejecting, say, the extremist Muslims who killed the Danish or who attacked the Danish cartoonists, right?
Right.
And I see that there is a tension there, that there are some terrible acts that they are more willing to condemn or can more easily condemn, or maybe conflict worse with, or in greater conflict with how they would like the world to be, how they would like to see the world. But it seems to me that that's true of just about everybody. It's certainly true, an analog in the United States might be the ease with which the right wing can condemn Islamic terrorism, and yet someone like Timothy McVeigh throws the right for a much greater loop, and they have a much more difficult time responding to it. They certainly condemn it. At the same time, they respond to it very differently, right? And circling back to the larger question of a Christian Europe, one thought I have is that I don't know a ton about Norway specifically. It's not one of the countries I've ever visited or that I know a ton about. And when I think about Europe's ability to assimilate immigrants, it seems to me that the EU's the ability to travel between all EU countries once you're in one of them complicates things. At the same time, it seems to me that someplace like Spain, where the Andalusians and the Basque and the Catalans can't even all agree that they're in the same nation, they should be in the same nation, or they share a common culture, right? It's much different to send immigrants to there than it is to send them to, say, France, where you have where you've had problems with large-scale immigration, but you also have, I think, as close to a civic ethic that's similar to the United States as you can get. And by that, I don't mean that the French and American ethics are the same, just that you can conceive of this. They have something that they can appeal to that is not ethnic, right? And so I think it seems to me that more than religion, what's going on in Europe, it isn't so much about Christianity and how Christian Europe is. It's about how much the conception in different European countries of citizenship, how much it's ethnic, right? And there's been this post-World War II, let's never let the Nazis happen again ethic that has grown up around tolerance and being tolerant of difference. And the tension to me is between this idea of ethnic citizenship and belonging that has always existed in Europe and hasn't been replaced by anything in a lot of countries, because nationalism is feared, and because there is no common ethic like the French or the American ethics. And at the same time, this need to now reject a virulent strain in an immigrant population, that's very hard to do, right? Because there is a lot of illegitimate prejudice against some of the immigrants coming in. At the same time, there is legitimate prejudice against some of their worst ideas. And I think that you see it most clearly in some place like Amsterdam, where you have where you have tension between the gay population and the Muslim population. And if you look at the religious attitudes, the attitudes toward something like gay marriage of the Muslim immigrants who are going in and living in Amsterdam, and you think about being a gay person there, and looking at the demographics and thinking, if this goes on for another 20 years, is my lifestyle still going to be legal in my municipality? right?
Right.
You can see why there would be anti-immigrant sentiment there in a way that just doesn't map onto the United States. And so I think I agree that I agree that there are legitimate concerns to be raised. But I guess I think that Anders Breivik is so extreme that he's almost an easier case to dismiss.
Well, he's easy to dismiss in the sense of, like, he murdered 77 people.
Right.
I mean, it's so bang, that's it. You know, but he has this kind of twisted way where he says, I take responsibility for my actions, but I'm not guilty because I was acting in self-defense. Which is like, I don't know, it's like passive aggressiveness times a bazillion.
Yeah, well, I guess it's the appeal. One of the appeals that he was making, and again, I haven't read his entire manifesto. I've just read news coverage of the trial so far. But one of the appeals that he was making was to say, I don't recognize the legitimacy of this court because it is run by multiculturalists. It is run by people who want to or have no problem with mixing immigrant blood and Norwegian blood, and so I was acting in self-defense, right? And
Right.
This line of reasoning doesn't seem like one that anyone in the Norwegian mainstream is going to have a problem rejecting, and it doesn't. I don't think that it maps onto the larger tension between tolerance and multiculturalism and nationalism. I don't think it maps onto all those things in a problematic way that is going to create an put them in an uncomfortable intellectual spot. But maybe there's more to his appeal that I'm missing that will do that. That will.
My thinking is that there is a way in which his assertion of a kind of, I almost want to use the word integrist Norwegian identity, I think challenges liberalism in a way that liberalism will find difficult to confront without also, without also eventually chucking multiculturalism. I mean, where, Norway's liberalism might have to be, in a sense, monocultural. The way that, as you said, if Amsterdam allows Islamic immigration and Islam's religious ethos to become dominant in Amsterdam, Amsterdam will no longer be liberal. And so, there's an element where Anders Breivik forces Norway's political class to finally say, like, this is a heresy, this kind of nationalism, and we have to anathematize it.
Right.
And then merely by doing that, they create the condition where they could, in a sense, say that our security and our the Commonwealth is in jeopardy from certain ideas, and we have a right to vanquish those ideas. And once you do that, you're no longer really liberal anymore, in a thoroughgoing sense. So that's why I'm watching this trial so intently. I think Breivik should be executed for his crimes. He won't be because it's Norway. If I was in Norway, I think I'd feel like I would want to limit this guy's ability to speak over our heads through the media as much as possible. And I'd,
right.
turn the thumbscrews on him.
Right. Certainly, it seems like you could. It seems like you could satisfy the demand for a trial that was transparent without having it be broadcast in real time and give this guy an ability to use it as a propaganda outfit. I don't think that there's any requirement of justice that should...
They are doing that, but even that works to his advantage in some way, right? So they're going to have 5 days, I think, where he is on the stand. And they're not going to live broadcast those portions of the trial, precisely because of this.
Right.
But in a way, that already means he's winning a small victory, right? In that, he's getting special treatment in a sense because his views, they are so fearful of his views, right?
Right. Well, yeah, I guess. I don't know. I'll be curious. I'll be curious to watch this, and maybe we can, maybe a month down the line or something, we can return to it and talk about it again. One thing, I guess, to throw out a counter hypothesis. I don't know if it will play out this way, but a more positive spin on Norway's reaction to all this is that while they face different issues in responding to this sort of thing than we would in the United States. There's a way in which this was a national trauma for them on the level of 9/11 for us.
Absolutely.
And they, so far, arguably, have not reacted to it in all of the self-defeating ways that we reacted to 9/11. In the immediate aftermath of it, there were a lot of statements from Norwegian officials, from Norwegian police, about how it's important that we not let this change our society. And maybe that's ultimately impossible. I don't know. It's yet to be seen. But I think at least the impulse there was very different than the impulse in the United States. In some ways that I agree were problematic, but in other ways that could save them from the things that we've done to ourselves in the face of a horrific attack. And so it seems to me that it could play out either way, and we don't know yet.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Well, let's shift gears and talk about as opposite a topic you can get, which is the essay that Katie Roiphe has written in Tina Brown's Newsbeast. I don't know. Was it a Newsweek? It was a Newsweek cover story, and
it's the Newsweek cover story. Yeah.
Okay, and the piece is about women and sexual submission, and whether recent pop culture portrayals of women wanting aggressive sex or wanting to be spanked or wanting to be dominated, whether this is an outgrowth of women's power in society, whether women are, having higher job achievement and higher academic achievement, and is this creating a psychological backlash, or maybe not a backlash, is it creating this psychological fantasy of being dominated? Katie Roiphe says yes. And so we can talk about her thesis. And I'd also like to talk about the anti-Katie Roiphe sentiment that sweeps the Twitter sphere and the blogosphere every time. It seems every time she writes something substantial, there are people, there are young people at Gawker who go into fits of rage and want to, and really, I mean, I think Katie Roiphe may be the most maligned non-right-wing writer among a certain set of I guess you'd call them mainstream blogs. So what are your thoughts about all this?
I'm having trouble processing it, right, on one level, because I read the piece and I thought, okay, here's a kind of not particularly great or horrible trend piece, right?
Yeah, I agree.
And it points to some pop culture stuff, and to me it doesn't seem, Hamilton Nolan, who I love over at Gawker, talked about the sourcing of it and how it's not that great. But I felt like a lot of the critics of the piece were ascribing to it a broader thesis than it actually had. Like, as if the author had somehow, by the end of the piece, thought that she had entirely dismantled feminism, which I don't think she was pretending to do or tried to do or did.
No, I didn't get that at all. I agree.
So
I should say, Katie Roiphe has written a lot of provocative pieces in her career. She is a writer who has a preternatural ability to seize on small contradictions in the thought of the people that she is, the theses that she's writing against. She's someone who has an ability to spot arguments that are going to upset people or challenge their preconceptions in deep ways. And she has an ability to phrase things in a way that'll really twist the knife in those arguments and take it maybe a half a step further than you expect in a very provocative way that gets people talking. I didn't see that in this piece. I've seen that in a lot of her writing. To me, this piece, it seems to me that, I think she's a wonderful writer, and I enjoyed reading it. I think she did a better version of this piece than a lot of people have done. But I think a lot of people have done a version of this piece. Maybe the particular books and movies they're talking about have been different. I mean, you could have written this piece and you could have substituted Mad Men for one of the books. You could have, I think that in some ways, Caitlin Flanagan's piece on the rise of vampires overlapped with this. In some ways, and so yeah, I guess in the spirit of full disclosure, I took a couple of classes with Katie at NYU, and and I audited both of them and found them valuable enough that as a lazy grad student, I kept showing up and doing all the assignments. But I don't know. She was a very, very good line editor, and someone who was a wonderful professor. I think that her pieces in the Paris Review, that are interviews of great nonfiction writers, are some of my favorite of her stuff. She's done one recently on Janet Malcolm, and I think on Gay Talese before that, if memory serves. But yeah, one day I would like to write an essay that explores the various iterations of Katie Roiphe hatred, because it seems to me that they often say as much about the people writing them as Katie Roiphe herself or what she's written, and I haven't quite put my finger on what exactly that is, though.
It's a very weird thing, right? So the word everyone was using was that she's trolling, like the world. And further, I wonder if we're just so oversaturated with media, like the people that work in the media are so oversaturated with media, and for some reason they're taking this piece as like this grand definitive statement of that. It's just they're ascribing to it a profundity and an ambition that I just didn't see at all. I mean, basically, I thought as an editor, I was thinking, okay, here are a bunch of things in pop culture. It raises some weird questions about how women think of sex and then their position in society. And it's a great chance to put on some sexy cover art on our cover. And kind of give readers this, like, ooh, you're reading about S&M thrill in a Newsweekly.
Right.
Well, that's it.
I mean, Tina Brown is unbelievably able to get a bunch of people talking about the cover of Newsweek. And as someone who has watched that magazine, I am unendingly impressed by her ability to do that. Yeah, I think I agree with your assessment of this piece, and it's so weird to me that, I mean, how are you going to be a writer at Gawker and complain that someone is trolling in an essay, right? Like, are you kidding me? It's it's certainly orders of magnitude less trolly than everything on their site every day. So I don't know, but I would love. I don't know, but Katie Roiphe is a writer that I really like, and I would love to see her. If I could have my way in the world, I would kick Maureen Dowd out of the New York Times and put Katie Roiphe in her spot. And
that'd be a great addition. I think that too, and I don't particularly love her, but I just think thinking as an editor, the same way that Tina Brown, I guess, thought of this piece, which is that it's provocative, it's interesting, it's what people like to talk about, frankly.
Right. Well, and I also, and one thing I appreciate about her, I mean, as someone who doesn't fit easily into any political camp and thinks it is important to tweak the wrong-headed ideas of those who agree with you on base-level political philosophy things, as well as people who disagree with you. I appreciate her ability to be broadly on the center-left, if unclassifiable in her politics, and yet to go after the flaws that she finds in what is broadly her own political orientation, right?
Yeah, let me say something in her defense, too, actually, on this piece in particular. Let me drill down a little bit further.
Yeah.
Which is that the response to her has been, ooh, shocker, people have fantasies about dominance? Wow, tell us something new, Katie. And that to me seems totally inadequate, because so much of liberal discourse is about making our social norms conform to our ideals, right? So it's not enough just to treat people equally according to the law. You actually have to not be racist and not be sexist. And what Katie is saying is that there is this one area that seems not only resistant to ideals of equality, but positively almost like reactionary. Like right. The more equality we get, perhaps the more S&M, or fantasies of dominance, become live or interesting to women. So it seems perfectly reasonable to bring this up in a trend piece and get people talking about it.
And to say that it's trolling is almost to concede. It's almost equivalent in a way to making the statement, "I am easily manipulated into being offended." Right. So yeah, I don't know.
I mean, yeah, it's not. Listen, it's not something on the level of the feminine mystique or the second sex. It's a freaking Newsweek cover story. Just that's it. I don't know. That's all I have to say about it then.
Yeah. Okay. Well, so maybe a tangentially related topic. We've seen a lot in political media lately about the role women are going to play in the upcoming election between Obama and Romney. And I wrote a piece in The Atlantic where I argue that there is a bipartisan interest in making women feel bad. And what I mean by this is that for Democrats, one of the themes that they have trotted out is that there is a war on women. And it's an umbrella term that they've used to refer to a bunch of different discrete policy battles, one of which is whether employers are mandated to provide health insurance that covers contraception without a copay. The Democratic language for this is misleadingly whether women have, quote, access to contraception. And of course, it isn't actually about access. It's about who pays for it. No one's arguing that contraception should be illegal. And I'm trying to think. I'm blanking on what's the other thing that lately they've been referring to under the banner of war. Oh, Rush Limbaugh's comments about Senator Fluke was a kind of this rhetoric is being used, and then
right, and the transvaginal
right the transvaginal ultrasound bill,
yeah,
and so my take on these Democratic talking points is basically that I think that some of the critiques that the Democrats are making of Republican bills are sound and others aren't. I mean, I happen to not think that employers should be required to subsidize birth control if they don't want to. I think that people are perfectly willing to make arrangements with their employers about health insurance and perfectly able to buy contraception if it happens to be something that isn't covered in their plan. But, I think that the transvaginal ultrasound bill is a terrible idea. And all this to say that I think Democrats are perfectly, whether I agree with them or not, they're perfectly within their rights to make a case against any of these policies. To call it a war on women implies first that the intention behind these things is to get women to war on women, and this certainly isn't the intention behind the legislation. In fact, you'll find a lot of women on both sides of a lot of these questions, and it just exaggerates the degree to which women are under fire from Republicans. It's one thing to say this policy would, on average, make women worse off, or this policy is a bad idea. It's another to say that one of our two political parties is targeting a gender in a way that is designed to do the metaphorical equivalent of shooting at them. Or, I mean, it's a confusing metaphor, so it's hard to say exactly what it means. But at the same time, there's certainly a political interest in scaring women, and I think the access to abortion, the access to contraception thing is the thing that jumps out at me the most as this misleading phrasing where if you're someone who pays attention to politics, you know what's going on. But if you're the average person who's not paying that close attention, you'll get the idea. You're intended to get the idea from this language that if the wrong party wins this election, you might go to the drugstore and not be able to have access to contraception. You might not find it on the shelves, right?
Right.
And it's just something that, the victim in this case is the person who's being misled into being more frightened about political outcomes than facts justify. I think that a similar thing is going on the Republican side, where this woman goes on CNN, what's her name? Hillary Rosen, I think, and makes a comment about how Mitt Romney is saying that he's sending his wife out to ask women about ask women what they are interested in this election, and his wife is telling him that they're interested in economic issues, and she said something to the effect of, well, Ann Romney, how would she know? She's never worked a day in her life. This is someone who is a talking head on cable news, and it is in the larger world of, you could call it the politics profession, political operative or whatever. But it's someone who, no one's heard of this person until this controversy. And, to elevate this talking head segment on CNN into something that's dominated headlines for days, and Republicans saying that there is a disdain by the Obama administration for stay-at-home moms strikes me as ridiculous. I don't know what Obama's personal opinion is of stay-at-home moms, whether he disdains them or feels great about them. Certainly, in 4 years of his administration, I don't think that stay-at-home moms have suffered from a policy targeted at them. I don't think if he's reelected that they're going to suffer from any policy that's targeted at them. And it just seems like an excuse to make these women stay-at-home moms in this case, or conservative women who are sympathetic to stay-at-home moms. It just seems like an excuse to make them feel as if they're more disdained than facts justify. It's not to say that there aren't liberals out there who disrespect the choices of women who stay home. It's not to say that that isn't a conversation that is legitimate to have, but the effort to impute it to President Obama when he and his campaign immediately distanced themselves from it, and to try and say that this is the general liberal opinion and that stay-at-home moms are under fire, it just seems exaggerated, and again that there's an interest in stirring up people. And I guess one last point, and then I'll let you jump in, is that both of these things, right, the war on moms and the war on women as shorthand, they're basically just a way that the Republicans and Democrats respectively distract the people in their coalition from the larger issues that they ought to care about. And so Republicans can get away with stirring up these culture war issues and not doing anything about the larger things that conservatives are supposed to care about. And at the same time, Obama can break all sorts of promises that he made before being elected, can betray progressives in all sorts of ways. And then when it comes time for an election, you just make the Republicans seem very scary and retrograde about women, and you win. And so I think that
Right.
Even though my complaint is about partisan bickering, it is different in that usually you'll hear people say, oh, partisan bickering, they're being unfair to one another. But my bigger concern is that they're being unfair by scaring the people in their own coalition and by using these issues to not address things that are more important to their coalition. So I've talked too long, so jump in.
Okay, a couple things. One, I'm going to say something offensive about women, okay, as a voting bloc, or at least what this says about them. If these things, the war on women or the war on moms, have the effect that you say they're intended to,
right? Which they may not, but yeah,
it would prove that a lot of women are willing to believe someone hates them if you tell them that they do. Like, ooh, that person over there, they hate you. Oh, really? They do? Like, I hope women are not that pathetic. And then on the other side, I'm willing to defend a little bit of this culture war nonsense. Well, at least at the phenomenal level, right? It's a phenomenon. I think a lot of people are totally disengaged from politics for good reason. They are one vote out of 100 million or 150 million, right? Which is like a mouse fart in a wind tunnel. Like, you are not, the average person will have almost no effect on political outcomes in the United States on a national level. You or I, we have like microphones and platforms from which to talk about these things. You and I have startlingly little effect on this process, and we study and think about it all the time.
Yeah.
And so I think people in a state like that look on their political leaders, and the president in particular, the way that people might have previously looked on monarchs, right? That this is just some inspirational figure who embodies the national mood, and that's it. But because it's a democracy formally, we have these elections, and so people try to divide each other on these cultural affiliation issues. So, oh, Obama's against moms? I'm a mom. I want to be in America where I feel at home. And, oh, the Republicans want to take away my contraception? My gosh, I've been using contraception for 15 years, and I'm a perfectly normal person. Fuck them. I'm not going to vote for them. And then that's it. And if that's the only... And I think these are very illiterate responses in terms of policy, right? So like you said, someone gets the idea in their head almost that, oh, if Rick Santorum wins the Republican nomination, suddenly condoms and chemical contraceptions will just like disappear,
Right.
sort of like as if they'd been raptured away by God in some like bizarre Left Behind series that they'd never read. And then on the other side, like, who knows? So they get these exaggerated views, but these exaggerated views are a way of rousing normal, apolitical people into affiliating with one side or another. And I don't know, that's the machinery of democracy as I see it. I almost accept it for what it is. And the media plays its role too. But, in general, people on the left make arguments that, well, if you are a modern liberal person that engages in a kind of normal American sex life, you should be on our side. And conservatives say, hey, if you think culturally things are kind of out of control in regards to sex, marriage, and family, you should be on our side. And so that's it. And,
the problem, though, is when I guess it would be one thing if these small fights were at least aligning people into sides that ultimately corresponded meaningfully to these larger tensions in culture. I don't know that that's true at all, though.
I agree with you.
And I also think, you said earlier that if this is true, if women are responding to being told that they're under fire in this way, it says something poor about women. I don't know if I think that that's true in the sense that, I think that this is something that is both, I think this is true of voters generally, and it may be to their discredit. It probably is. But, the women you are under attack is just a subset of this larger, gun owners you are under attack, talk radio listeners you are under attack, people clinging to guns and religion you are under attack. And I think that it I don't know how well it works. I don't think it works on everyone, men or women. I think it works on some people, and that's why you see it. And it makes me, part of it makes me wonder if there isn't just a human need to be afraid of things, and that maybe we just need more Summer of the Sharks to, so that people are afraid of things that don't map onto the political coalitions that they arrange themselves into.
I think that's true, but history has a way of taking these kind of weird, dramatic turns that, especially to the uneducated, seem crazy, right? So, at some point in the antebellum South, politicians were saying, slavery is under attack, slavery is under attack, people are against this, they're against you, they're against the Southern man, they're against property, whatever. And then Sherman's armies actually came through and burned shit. And I'm not saying that like anyone is on that level now, or that we actually have cultural and political battle lines drawn in a way like the pre-Civil War America did. But I do think people find history kind of unpredictable. I do think Americans also feel this weird foreboding that we've had it too good historically, and that something bad is going to happen. And, lastly, instilling those fears is a way of rousing people to vote. What better way to affiliate with someone than to be under siege with them,
I guess I don't know. I think that your example of the pre-Civil War South, right? Slavery was, in fact, under attack from a sustained movement that wanted to end it, right? And I'm not claiming that it's wrong to tell people that they're under attack when it is in fact so. Of course, I'm glad that
of course we want to
slaveholders lost. I'm glad
we are attacking slavery on this blogging heads.
But yeah, I mean, I don't think that there's any sense in which moms are under attack. And I think that part of the problem here, right, when you think about the difference between telling slaveholders that they're under attack and telling moms that they're under attack, right, there's a way in which metaphors of war and violence map uneasily onto politics. Sometimes they work and other times they don't, and we use them all the time without really teasing out how direct a connection is or what precisely we're saying. I just don't think that the metaphor works with moms. It's not to say, it would be fair to say that stay-at-home moms are under criticism in various parts of our culture. That's a very different thing, right? And if you were going to find a metaphor for it, maybe it wouldn't be so much like war. Maybe the metaphor would be, I don't know, being jeered at in the playground or something. Something far less problematic that a lot of people could just laugh off, and that a lot of people do just laugh off. I also think that there are in fact things, right, that Americans could legitimately feel under siege about, that maybe we ought to be more afraid of than we are. The
erosion of our civil liberties, the
right.
corrosive effect of perpetual war,
or a meteor hitting Earth, right, that we're not prepared for because we just haven't gotten
because of Hillary Rosen
to doing it, right? But partly because of Hillary Rosen and the people who reacted against her, right? Not Hillary Rosen in this instance. I don't think that Hillary Rosen did anything but misspeak in a way that was blown way out of proportion. In a larger sense, I think she's part of this bipartisan inside the Beltway system of talking about ridiculous things that don't map onto America's real priorities very, very well. But I don't know if you watched Obama down at the Summit of the Americas, and he came under fire for a couple of different policies, for the war on drugs, from some Latin American countries that have been devastated by it, and for the ongoing embargo against Cuba. And in my mind, he basically embarrassed himself and the United States by trying to mount defenses of these policies that he didn't believe himself, because there's no good defense of the status quo in my mind. He said, for example, that in his way of, I'm going to concede something rhetorically to my opponent, he said, well, it's legitimate to talk about the idea that maybe the status quo of drug policy is serving some countries bad somewhere. Like, really, you're going to tell a room full of Mexicans and Colombians that it's legitimate to maybe converse about the idea that somewhere it's possible that it could be affecting a country worse? Give me a break. And I just think that there's a sense in which the terrain in which our political debate happens is just so disconnected from the actual policy outcomes, the actual problems, and that it would be so easy for someone to come along and start talking about any number of issues, whether it's civil liberties erosions, whether it's the drug war, whether it's the Wall Street bailouts, and sort of say, wow, the emperor has no clothes. Look at this absurdity. Look at what's actually going on. And we're headed into an election where neither Romney nor Obama are going to do that, because neither of them has an interest in drawing attention to these absurdities that they're complicit in. So instead, we're going to talk about who's warring on women.
Well, I think the disconnect you're finding between our political rhetoric and policy is directly related to the over-connection with our political rhetoric and what are really moral and social and cultural debates that seem to happen nowhere else but in political discourse. Of course, they're happening in the pulpit and at the family dinner table or in front of the television. But our public intellectuals that talk about politics talk about, when we are getting together to debate something about some social policy, we are also debating about who should be stigmatized and what behaviors shouldn't be stigmatized anymore. And average people, feel much more connected to their culture's sense of praise or shame than they do actual written laws and policies enacted far away from them. So, the end, I guess. I think that explained everything I think about the culture war and our politics in 2 minutes. But that really is the way I think it is that this is where people relate is, am I the type of person that the president and that our culture approves of, or am I a type of person that they don't approve of? And the exact details, who's paying for the contraception, daycare, whatever, that's whatever.
Yeah, well, this maps onto another topic we were going to talk about, which is the GOP's failure to nominate what most Republicans would consider to be a reliable conservative. Their failure to do so in election cycle after election cycle. Ronald Reagan being the lone recent exception. And to me, part of the reason for this is that Republican voters are terrible at assessing how conservative their candidates are. The example I used when I wrote about this is that if you asked the average Republican voter whether Sarah Palin or John Huntsman had a more conservative record, I strongly suspect that the vast majority would say Sarah Palin. This is how she's thought of in our culture. She's thought of as a quote-unquote conservative firebrand, maybe a populist firebrand, terms that are not often teased apart in any very precise way. And John Huntsman's thought of as this squishy guy who got a profile written about him in Vogue, and who's a media darling, and who is very moderate and served in the Obama administration. If you go back and look at their respective terms, Huntsman was governor of Utah, which is not a place where you find a lot of liberal governance, and Palin's term in Alaska, by virtue of its peculiar politics that are so tied up in oil resources that are held in common, it's arguably the most socialistic state in the country, which isn't to say that Palin is a socialist by any means, but if you look at her governing record, a lot of what she did is help negotiate these deals with big oil companies that were basically, state redistribution of resources and economic planning. There's not a lot in her record to make conservatives think, oh, she's one of us. And in the recent GOP primary, you go down the line, Newt Gingrich was a choice for conservatives in the South, really? I mean, it's insane if you look at his history during the Bush administration of basically doing all of the things that conservatives hated. And to me, these culture war issues just end up misleading people into backing the wrong person.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more, right? I was the biggest John Huntsman is the conservative in this race drum beater. Yeah,
people should read your profile in the American.
I was like the drum machine of that drum. And it was cultural signifiers, and that seemed to matter, right? So Gingrich's belligerence, or fake belligerence to the media, was his signifier. In fact, it's weird, and you of all people are like you're like the biblical prophet Jeremiah of the way belligerence and meanness has become the signifier of conservatism, or like true conservatism, right? So that somehow, like, on a sliding scale, Mark Levin and Michael Savage become the most conservative people
Right.
because they're the biggest assholes. And, obviously that is a huge defect in the conservative mind or in the conservative psyche right now. It is literally, and I mean this in the most offensive way possible, retarded. So there you have it. And the thing is that it's very difficult to find good conservative governance, right, without at least some major slip-up, right? It's always this little paradox where you're looking for people who exercise power prudently and gingerly once they've been given that power.
Right.
And, it's very difficult. In a way, it's why I personally think conservatives, if they want to accomplish anything, should look to Congress much more than the presidency and look to
I think that's right.
The ability of Congress to check the power of the executive and even to limit the power of the judiciary.
Right.
Because I think conservative success in America is achieved not through these meteoric Caesars that rise to the presidency like Reagan or like Buchanan wanted to do in the 90s, but it's by establishing constraints and checks and hurdles to change that's hasty or ill thought out.
Right.
And also just the slow, laborious process of law and order itself, which is why Congress's investigative and oversight powers need to continue to be used vigorously.
Right.
So that's also a long way of saying I hope Rand Paul does not get nominated for vice president and leaves the Senate.
He's certainly a valuable presence in the Senate, and I think that civil libertarians especially should be interested in the Senate more than the presidency after the betrayal of Obama basically being so good in his rhetoric on so many issues that civil libertarians care about, and then going down the line and betraying them on just about everyone. So let's close by talking about Mad Men.
Cool.
We've both watched up to the present date, up to last night's episode, and you said you had some thoughts about it. So why don't you start it off?
Well, I've always been of the opinion that part of Mad Men's appeal is in the retrograde manners of its male characters, of its pre-feminist manners.
Right. Yeah.
And this is partly in evidence that in the fact that Roger Sterling is probably everyone's favorite character. He's very well played by John Slattery, and the writers just give him beautiful lines every week.
Yeah.
So that certainly plays a role. And I do think that the show does really get at something about feminism itself. I think it's I know everyone's always looking to it and asking, when is it going to ask more uncomfortable questions about race or other things that were important in the 60s, civil rights, which have, been alluded to a few times through the series. But instead, it's focused much more on women in the workplace. And I think it's great.
I mean, the race question, I think it is good that it is focusing more on gender questions for the simple reason that we're not grappling with the same race questions anymore. The people who were against the civil rights movement in the 1960s have no defenders today. And so while it was, of course, very important at the time, it's not nearly so useful as a vehicle to think about our own world. And I think that the gender question, I mean, I would love to see a good essay comparing the feminism of Peggy and I'm blanking on her name, who is the sort of office manager / wife of the guy in Vietnam.
Joan Holloway.
Right. Comparing their different approaches to feminism and navigating the workplace as a female. I would love to see a great essay on that.
And it's interesting, too, sometimes it takes it on in interesting ways. I mean, I don't think we got a deep look into it last night. Spoiler alert for our watchers and listeners.
Yeah.
Where you were taken into a different sort of workplace, where you're taken to a whorehouse in the story, which was obviously run by a madam who, and, the hint also from, or the recall from Don Draper's character that he grew up in a whorehouse where his mother worked.
Yeah.
And, that's supposed to be contrasted, that kind of exploitation, whether it's entirely one way or mutual, is contrasted with the other exploitations at Sterling Cooper Draper Price, and the way that Lane all of a sudden quickly grabs Joan Holloway and kisses her.
Yeah.
Almost in recompense for the comfort she gives him. So, I think the show is, I know there's a lot of people who want to hate on it now, all of a sudden. Mm-hmm. And my feeling is, listen, it's what are we in the 5th season now, of essentially a really highbrow soap opera. Of course, were going to be some weird twists and turns along the way. But overall, I think the show is still as vital as it was the first year it came out. My only fear for it is that we're now heading into the hideously ugly portion of the 60s.
Right.
We're getting away from like these cool slim suits and into these horrible patterned dresses.
Hideously ugly as in the fashion and the aesthetic.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure there's other ugly 60s coming up with, we got, a hint last night from the shooting at University of Texas, and then also, there's been allusions to the increasing crime in New York City.
Right, yeah.
But I mean literally the horrifying curtain that seemed to strangle Megan last night and pretended to be a dress on this beautifully casted woman. It actually does take away some of the appeal for me. I guess I'm one of those people that really enjoys the superficial part of the show.
Yeah, the moment from last night's episode that grabbed me the most was the scene where, I guess 2 scenes. One where Pete gets beat up, which is basically the show's writers telling the audience, we understand what you've wanted all this time, we're going to give it to you. I think also the scene when they're at Pete's house for the dinner party. And I actually think Pete's wife is beautifully played and beautifully cast and beautifully written. Her ability to wrangle Dawn into the dinner date is, I thought, a small scene that was very well done. But so they're all at the Campbell's house, and they're in the kitchen,
in Greenwich, which they refer to as the country, which makes me laugh. But anyway.
So someone turns on the sink and water starts exploding out of it. All the men run into the kitchen, and it's, Don Draper, man of action. And he, immediately grabs a pot and throws it over so the water isn't going everywhere. And then he takes off his shirt and ducks down under the sink and very quickly fixes things. And it's I think there are a lot of moments in the show when the traditional masculine roles are kind of at odds with current mores, right? Where women watching the show are meant to feel this tension of, oh, this is both sexy but uncomfortable. I think the sink moment was one of the last permissible, sexy and yet still permissible moments, right? I think that the present-day feminist would have no problem with with Don's wife finding it sexy that he immediately seized the moment with competence and fixed the sink, right?
Right.
And so that was, I thought, an interesting moment to include as juxtaposition to other more fraught moments of gender differences, and actually. One other thing that I just thought of when you mentioned that Don grew up in a whorehouse was that in some ways he reminds me of a character whose name I'm blanking on in East of Eden. Was it Adam Trask who grew up?
Yeah, that sounds familiar.
I don't, but maybe it was Adam Trask's son that was that he discovered that she was a prostitute in a whorehouse, and I don't know. I've lost my train of thought now, but I'm going to return to this maybe in a future episode. But yeah, so that was my take on the most interesting moment of last night.
Yeah, I thought that was a great moment. It's funny. I've seen. It's interesting that display of confidence, take charge, and physical competence is considered uncontroversially sexy. Mm-hmm. I'm remembering a personal anecdote where, a girlfriend of mine at the time expressed something like admiration from seeing me digging a trench, basically, with a shovel. No, it is odd. Although I do wonder if it would have been as sexy at the time. I mean, I wonder if we're reading that backwards a little bit.
It could be. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, in the show, Don's wife is meant to find it sexy, but maybe, I don't know. I mean,
maybe everyone would see like, oh, okay, he was just the one that got in there and did it. And I also wonder too, would Campbell really be, would Pete Campbell be incompetent to do this? Because as Charles Murray has pointed out, it's, almost anyone who had some means back then usually was one or two generations removed from family members who were not of means. And so I wonder sometimes if Pete's disconnect is overdrawn. I'm not sure. And I want to say something in defense of the Pete Campbell character. Uh-huh. Pete Campbell is my favorite character on Mad Men by far. And I was happy that he got his ass kicked by Lane, who I also quite like. But I like Pete Campbell in that he's been corrupted in a very innocent way, almost. And I felt awful for him in that episode last night, in that he has merely tried to be like the other guys. He's tried to become successful, and he's used whatever advantages his father-in-law or whatever present situation presents itself to him. And sometimes he's even very honorably put his ambition aside, as when he didn't expose Don twice for Don's past.
Right, yeah, I mean, Pete certainly isn't a character who you can condemn outright, because he does have small moments of redemption.
And not only that, but I actually quite agreed with his wrangling with Don, in a sense. I mean, obviously, Campbell felt guilty about whoring around for his job. And he felt it was an insult that Don was suddenly superior to this sort of thing.
Right.
You know, and he's saying, I'm just doing my job. But, you know, I felt like telling Pete at the end of the episode when he's, like, confessing, I have nothing, you know, and it's contrasted with another character who writes fiction, Don, who suddenly has this, like, adoring sex kitten wife whom he's suddenly faithful to. And I was about to say, you know, Pete, you're not that far off. I mean, yes, you're lusting after some teenage girl in your driver's ed class. Yes, you're not the most popular guy at work. But, like, it's not all bad for you, Pete. Just, you know.
Well, one thing...
It didn't take Don very much to suddenly become this faithful guy to his new wife. There's no reason for Pete to feel that inferior to him.
Well, I think there are two reads on the Don-Pete contrast. And one read is that Don has been through various things in his life that give him perspective that Pete doesn't have. And because he's able to stand outside the situation and see that work isn't ultimately the thing, you know, for Don, work has never been the thing that has mattered the most, or even particularly. And there's something that we like about that. There's something that we like about his ability to step back and say, this is my life, I'm going to live it. I am a man who, for all my flaws, has his own way of looking at the world and is sort of the master of events rather than letting other people's opinions and mores bully him around, right? And Pete, on the other hand, is just slave to what other people think is cool, or what other people think is success, or you know what his wife wants to do. He is just the plaything of fate in many ways, right? Now, there's another way of looking at this that is that it sort of turns our traditional notions of what we like on our head, because here is Pete, who, despite coming from a wealthy family, is trying to make a success of himself, and is doing it by actually bringing in business, by actually succeeding at his job, and it doesn't come naturally to him. He has to work very hard to make this all happen. And so while we don't like his excesses, we don't like the shady ways he goes about doing this, you would think we would admire the effort, right? But I think that in Mad Men, it's written in a way that we don't, that most people identify with the characters that have this easy grace, right? That things just come naturally to them.
Right.
It's just natural for Don to be a good writer. It's just natural for Roger to be able to charm people and to get clients. It's just natural for Ken to be able to write well, right? And in the fight between Pete and Lane, we see two people for whom things aren't easy, for whom it does take hard work, who have chosen different ethics. And it's a fight between these two characters who are very similar in this one way, but who have taken it in very different directions. And I think that's the case for disliking Pete, that he could be Lane.
Yeah. I know we're running late. I have one more thing to say about Mad Men, which is this. The writers who write Betty Francis should be put on trial by the Hague Human Rights Court, because I've never seen anyone so nastily tortured in my life. It's like the hatred that the writers have for Betty is so palpable, it actually almost makes my eyes water when I watch the show.
Yeah, how are they going to make us like her again?
It's like they made her a controlling bitch with her children. They made her kind of like an insensitive, near racist with the housekeeper. They oddly gave Dawn the cruelest line in their big fight before the divorce, about, her mainline upbringing. And then finally they make her ugly, too. At the end, they make her fat. And it's just like, I don't know.
Yeah, I can't believe that there's not going to be some attempt to play with our emotions and try to make us like Betty again. I mean, it almost seemed like they were going to make her sick and do it that way, but then they didn't. So yeah, I don't know. I'm curious where the Betty Draper character is going, and
one thing that's very weird is that Betty Draper and then all of the older women characters, like Henry Francis's mother or Peggy's mother, are like, if people think that they're drawing caricatures of sometimes of the women of the 60s that are working age, the ones they draw of their parents are like insane. Sometimes.
Yeah, I think that's true. That's totally true.
Yeah, Peggy's mom is just like, all she thinks about is the Pope, and then like...
Right, and Betty's father too, and stepmother, was it?
Yeah. It's just absurd. So those are the only things I really fault the Mad Men writers on, is Betty Francis and then the grandmother characters in the show. But
right.
C'est la vie.
All right, well, we should quit because we are over, but it's been a pleasure, and let's do it again sometime.
All right, thank you so much, Connor.
All right, bye-bye.